I needed it.
What?
Yeah, that's the way. Of course, if I talk too long, you could just forward it on, for me to make sure that I stop talking. That's the other.
So am I sharing then? There now.
Yeah, you share, and you just move it on. If I talk too much, you can just get rid of me. You see, that's the upside for you.
Like the students do to us.
Okay.
Yes.
So I'm gonna. So really quick. I don't know if Louise is in yet. Louise from Brazil. Yeah, there's Louise. I did want to thank him really quick. Him and a few of his graduate students are going to be helping me out administering this. This actually takes quite a bit of work to get somebody to actually present and then align everything. And obviously we are on several different continents on a lot of different time zones, so it takes a little bit of coordination. So Louise and his grad students are actually going to help me out with this. So it's really awesome. That's going to be a great help. He's going to help out with the website and everything. So we won't have Tim, because Tim right now, it is about 2 a.m. there, not 10, it's 6 a.m. there. And Alan, it's 3 a.m. over there, so he won't be here either. So this is really the group for our first meeting of the year. And we're definitely going to try to have quite a few more meetings this year than we did last year. Obviously with COVID, we were cut down on being able to meet, but this year I really am trying to do 2 meetings or a meeting every other month, 6 during the year. So if anybody in here is interested in either presenting or discussing a reading topic, just let us know, and we can put you on the schedule for a future meeting, probably March. We don't have anybody for March, so if anybody does want to present in March, we're open for that. So you probably noticed that I started recording the sessions, so your sessions will be recorded, and then they'll actually be put on the website. Okay, so today we're having Mike Jess and Paul McKellen. This is I believe this is the first time we've had you, Paul, right?
That's right. Yeah, that's correct.
So welcome.
Yeah,
so,
thank you. I've heard a lot about the group, so glad to be here.
Awesome. So without any further ado, Mike and Paul.
Paul can start.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll talk today probably for about 30 minutes, and our topic is about embracing complex adaptive practice, and we're going to look at the potential of lesson study to connect with some of those ideas that we present to you about complex adaptive practice. This is a paper that we've had accepted in professional development and education, that should be part of a special issue about nonlinear perspectives in teaching and education. So we're quite excited about that. But it's the first time we've talked about some of these ideas to a bigger audience, so it's quite exciting. Thanks for coming too. So as an introduction and an overview of the presentation and the paper, I guess, at the same time, we'll talk about 4 main areas or 4 main sections in the presentation today. First up, there'll be an overview from myself that will talk very briefly about professional development, classroom practice and neoliberalism, and the sort of interplay in recent times and how classroom practice and professional development have been shaped and steered in a particular direction because of neoliberal agendas currently operating in quite a lot of countries around the world. Then Mike will provide an overview of complexity thinking, which some of you will be very familiar with some of the ideas, and that will include an overview of complex and complicated systems, and some key features will come out of complex systems, and we use those to shape up an idea about complex adaptive practice. I will return and we'll talk about lesson study and see that as one form of professional development that could foster and develop some of the ideas about complex adaptive practice that Mike will overview. And we'll probably both talk to, I'll start and Mike can also support point 4 there. We'll overview one project. We've actually got about 3 projects we can talk about, and 2 feature in the paper. We're just going to talk about 1 today, and that'll be our work with a whole secondary school in Scotland, and how the next step in their project could be shaped by complex adaptive practice features of today and what that might look like and what it might involve in the future. So very briefly, an idea that neoliberalism and neoliberal policy agendas in many countries have started to dominate education and the educational landscape. And that has created a competitive culture, a competitive arena within schools, between schools, and between countries at the same time. And we're very familiar with international league tables in terms of education and the educational standing of different countries in those league tables. And there's a big idea that improved school effectiveness could be achieved by starting to really scrutinize and improving what teachers do in the classroom, which could be a very simplistic approach. How can we define a feature, an idea about teachers' practice that would be effective with all kids in all countries and for all learners? So it's very much a linear, straightforward take on what teachers do in the classroom. Why that's become an issue and why that's come to the fore is that schools are becoming increasingly risk averse, and this is it's not new, but the work of Page from Leeds Beckett University has really been starting to talk about the risk averse situation that schools are in and how that has had an impact on surveillance, and it's got a very contemporary interpretation of how teachers are being surveilled more carefully, and rather than looking at what teachers do in the past to observe and then help them, there's an idea that things start to be more future oriented, and there's mechanisms in place that are starting to try and predict in the future how teachers will perform and to try and control that in the future and to try and shape that in a direction that might be more effective. Therefore, we're starting to get less and less, according to Sarah Delamont, or it could be Bista that we have there as well. We're starting to see less and less examples of studies that are starting to investigate the real nitty-gritty, the fine print of what teachers do in the classroom and trying to celebrate that complexity. Instead, the narrative, certainly at government level in many countries, seems to be that teachers are becoming increasingly positioned as a technician, where they can do similar practices across various classes, and they will all seemingly have an impact on a range of different learners. Some countries, it's a very small list, but have managed to not completely ignore the neoliberal demands in countries, but they've managed to resist them to some degree. And our own Scottish context could be argued as one of those areas that's been a bit more resistant to neoliberal crackdown from governments and government levels. Therefore, there's an idea when the scope, according to Herr Bista, the idea is that we're looking to try and recapture the art of teaching. What is it? What are the fine-grained arts of teaching to celebrate them and trying to put them and position them back on the map?
So I'll take over now, and we're looking really at the idea of teaching in the classroom as a complex adaptive practice. And this is something that Paul and I and others have been working at for quite a number of years. And this paper, I suppose, is not the first one, but it certainly brought together a lot of ideas to try and articulate more clearly how we viewed the idea of teachers' practice as being complex. And as we've done in most of our work, we start off with systems thinking. And this idea that systems are, one definition, an interconnected set of elements that somehow are coherently organized to achieve something. And that something is obviously very broad in terms of what that could be. And if we look at the world or the universe that we live in, there are some very, very large systems, the universe itself and the world and tropical rainforests. And there are small systems like humans and watches and computers. And in terms of that whole view of systems, what we become particularly interested in is this difference between systems that are complicated and systems that are complex. And briefly, and I'm sure most of you sort of know where I'm coming from here, but in the complicated system, the parts are pre-programmed, it's linear, it's closed loop, and the relationship with the external world is quite limited. And therefore, we're looking at the idea of predictability repeated after time. Now, we might use examples like watches and cars, and particularly traffic lights is a good example of that. But just below there, the idea of the neoliberal context, in terms of some of the points that Paul was making, is that the education system, and that includes teachers' professional development, and it also includes teachers' classroom practice, share many features of that complicated system. And I'm not going to argue that the whole thing about a complicated system is wrong. I think there's lots of brilliant elements that fit in. But from a human perspective, I think it's important that we start to look at the idea of the complex system, where yes, humans are ordered and they're predictable, but they also have a self-organizing capacity, as all complex systems do, which means that the different parts of the system interact with each other, but also with the external environment. And therefore, what we start to get are very rich interactions that can, yes, produce predictability, but also can be unpredictable. And perhaps most importantly for this presentation, these complex systems are dynamic, they're transformational, and they are adaptive, or they have the capacity to be adaptive. And we would argue that the education systems in the world that we live in actually are complex systems which over periods of time self-organize, interact, and behave in emergent ways. So that's really the starting point for where we're coming from. And that's not necessarily anything particularly new. But over time, we start to look at how ideas from complexity can help this idea of adaptive practice. And just if I highlight that adaptive practice requires teachers to not only respond to, but also influence that ever-changing environment in which they are working. And we build on work that I wrote earlier with Jean Kay and Nicola about professional learning as an adaptive practice. And we look at the ideas of self-organization, recursive elaboration, negotiating boundaries, making connections, and reflecting inquiry as key elements within this idea of complex adaptive practice. Now, I could talk about this probably until about next Thursday. So what I want to do is very much focus on self-organization, and particularly this idea of negotiating boundaries. I'll mention recursive elaboration as I talk through this. And don't get me wrong, making connections and reflecting inquiry are absolutely critical as we go down the road. But given the time constraints, I want to focus on particularly self-organization and negotiating boundaries. And if we want to develop adaptive practice, it's not a quick fix. It's not controlled by school management, and it's not about narrowly focused professional development courses. It's a complex, self-organizing process that evolves over a long period of time. And I was just thinking, this is my 47th or 48th year when I started being a PE student many years ago. And certainly my practice is still evolving as I work through and self-organize that. So it's very much a capacity building exercise. And I think that changes some of the simplistic notions we have of teaching. The personal vision of teachers, we would argue, and we've just had a paper written in the Curriculum Journal about the work that we're doing with our students on them developing a personal vision for education. And I could jump off at a tangent in here that I'm saying, I'm not sure that this is de facto about complexity, but I think complexity, this idea of self-organization, leads us to perhaps an assumption that teachers' personal visions for education are extremely important in this journey towards becoming adaptive practitioners. So I would argue that that self-organizing process, the vision that teachers have for education, is key to their complex adaptive practice, because it not just relates to what they do in the classroom, but also how they influence and are influenced by that nested wider school community and the boundaries, which I'll talk about later, across the whole world, basically. So a key part of this is that as teachers develop their vision, it's about taking a stand for a preferred future. And it gives meaning to their teaching. Now, we can go and unpack that in lots of ways, and I will in a minute, but I think it's important to highlight that complexity doesn't necessarily lead us to that, but I think the self-organizing process perhaps leads us to that. And therefore, as we will argue, that this vision is developing, this ongoing nature of their vision is a long-term part of teachers' professional development as they introduce, revisit, consolidate, elaborate, and can reflect not just on topics and knowledge, but also the skills of being a teacher. So that's where the recursive elaboration process goes out. But it's also very important to highlight, and we certainly found this with our own students, that teachers don't have the same personal visions for education because their histories are different, they're at different phases of their careers, and they all work in different contexts. So I think it's really important just to say that this self-organizing process, if teachers are not, I don't mean clear about what they want for out of education, but they do need this idea of a vision, and go back to that bit at the top of the page, to take a stand for a preferred future. But importantly, this self-organizing process doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's constrained and enabled by boundaries that teachers are constantly negotiating, not only in the classroom practice, but in a sense, in their preparation and everything that they're doing over time. Now, I've done lots of reading about boundaries recently, and to try and sort of make, hopefully this will not take as long as it could, but there seems to be some agreement that all learning is influenced, hindered, or facilitated by boundaries. And definition of boundaries are a little bit messy, but what's quite clear is that they're complex devices that limit, be it a space or a social grouping. And that can be physical, conceptual, functional, behavioral, and communicative. So the point here is that virtually everything out there can be a boundary. And for those of you who have done some work in motor control, motor learning, the language of constraints is probably part of the way you would think about this. But in terms of negotiating boundaries, and because there are so many, we like to use ecological ideas to help us frame all these boundaries. And we're talking specifically here in the classroom. And this is important because I think complexity is about connections, and ecology is about connections. So therefore, in the classroom setting, there are individual boundaries of the teacher. They're cognitive, social, emotional, and physical characteristics. There are boundaries within the immediate classroom setting, and that means their students, as well as the physical and also the broader and even national settings in terms of curriculum. And go back to what Paul was saying, that obviously in the neoliberal context is quite a strong influence. And I'd just like to say that clearly each student, as a holistic, complex being, has cognitive, social, emotional, and physical characteristics that are not all the same. And the third set of categories, relational ecological boundary, are the tasks that the teachers will design and present, and perhaps in some settings that the students will design and present. But these can be cognitive, social, emotional, and physical. So I think to make sense of this, these boundaries, and certainly in the work that we've been doing, is very helpful in helping us understand how the teacher is engaging with this vast array of boundaries. And to be adaptive, teachers will need to identify boundaries they can influence, while also acknowledging that there are some boundaries that they're unlikely to impact upon, for example, the weather. Also, because of their different personal visions, their histories, etc., as I said, when we engage with a boundary, we do not necessarily engage with it in the same way, because we come at this as complex being from perhaps a different perspective. And therefore, the boundaries, to add to the complexity of this, are ambiguous. So as we work our way along this adaptive journey and engage with these boundaries, identifying and actually trying to negotiate them becomes a key part of what we do. Now, as I just move on, I just want to say 2 or 3 more slides just about boundaries. As our idea of adaptive practice developed, instead of the traditional filling the empty vessel and throwing out simplistic linear ideas of knowledge, increasingly, I think we're acknowledging that students, as our own learning is cumulative over time. It's not superficial. So as we become adaptive practitioners, we're looking to support students in this cumulative learning. So we start to see some sort of integrated, connected progression that makes sense as they move on, and also this capacity to transfer across different contexts. So therefore, it may be that at the start of a series of lessons, we begin with a specific learning intention, but as lessons progress and we start to engage with all the different boundaries, we need to be more flexible in these intentions as we negotiate the boundaries, and we start to identify different intentions for different students. And as we revisit similar learning contexts in that recursive way, we will meet similar boundaries and we will meet new boundaries. And it's this capacity to negotiate these different boundaries that is about supporting students' cumulative learning. And I think this is where it starts to get messy, but really interesting. We need to consolidate some learning. We need to challenge existing learning. And we need to look at the idea of being creative in our learning. So as we work our way through to build this cumulative learning, we need to go through an interactive and an interweaving process to consolidate, challenge, and support creativity as we work in boundaries. And my final slide, and I could talk about this for ages, as we go through this process, and if you think about your own learning, there's things that we need to consolidate. There's times where we need to be challenged, and there's times that we need to start to be creative. So when we're consolidating, we're playing safe inside the boundaries. When we're challenging, we're going around the boundaries. And when we're going beyond the boundaries, we have the opportunity to be creative. And if you think of that in a movement sense, bouncing a basketball can become quite simple and playing safe. You can add challenges by putting a defender, for example, and then we can set up opportunities for students to go beyond the boundaries of what's normal. Of course, the negative is that if we play safe too much, it becomes boring. If we push too hard at the boundaries, it becomes stressful, and maybe too stressful and breaks down. And it becomes chaotic if we go and it completely goes into meltdown. So my point that I'm wanting to make here is that as we work along this recursive process, teachers and the students that they're working with are always negotiating boundaries, and we need to identify those. And in terms of our visions, our self-organizing vision, how do we as teachers negotiate those boundaries in relations to the students in the context that we're working with? So this idea of adaptive practice, self-organizing, recursive elaboration, negotiating boundaries. And if I had time, I would talk about making connections and reflecting inquiry as that process unfolds. So I know I've talked a lot there, and hopefully it opens up the opportunity for some discussion about this whole idea of boundaries particularly. So I'll go back to Paul and let him talk about how this idea of complex adaptive practice is ideally suited to the notion of lesson study.
Thank you, Mike, for that. Yeah, switching over now to talk about more focused on lesson study. And we see and argue in the paper that developing complex adaptive practice, as you can imagine, is not a quick fix. It's not going to happen in the short term. Therefore, we need a professional development tool or professional development format that's also going to connect into that long-term ongoing demand of complex adaptive practice. So again, something that's long-term, recursive, and non-linear. And we present lesson study here, and again, we could present another format as well. We're not saying this is the only way to develop complex adaptive practice. Underneath the umbrella of broad ways that you can observe in-house or on-site professional development, this could have been learning rounds or learning walks or collegial visits, but we talk about lesson study here for a number of reasons. Mostly that it's quite a focused approach. It's not an anything goes when you engage with lesson study. It provides structure. So practitioner inquiry is on the radar of a lot of countries, but it doesn't necessarily give you a real focus on what it is and how you go about doing that inquiry. It's focused in lesson study is on the classroom practice, so the exchanges that happen every day on a classroom practice. That is the focus of lesson study. So that was another reason why lesson study became important, because we're looking to try and engage with that in terms of the complex features Mike's alluded to. Two more, it's collaborative. So not all practitioner inquiry is collaborative. And not all forms of it are got structure. So we're collaborative, and the last point is it's highly reflective. So collaboration or reflection with others is a sort of mainstay of lesson study, and therefore it seemed to be a good fit to develop some of these features that Mike's been talking about. It's not new. Some of you may have heard of this before. It's absolutely not new at all. It's been around in Japan and parts of the Far East since the late 1800s. But I guess it became much more prominent in the West from 1999 when Stiegler and Hebert decided they were interested in finding out the secrets of education systems around the world that were performing very highly in international comparison charts. And amongst other things, they honed in on lesson study, which they uncovered in Japan. And from then, it's become a very massive area of research in America and in Europe now as well. And quite a lot of that focus of attention has been on literacy and numeracy. So again, it's not new at all. It does have a track record for enhancing. This is that middle point is a big systematic review that's looked at how it's been able to transform teaching behavior, professional beliefs, pedagogical skills, and teachers' content knowledge. And I guess at the heart of that, the reflection and collaborative and ongoing nature of that's been key. It offers a safe space, we think, to explore the length of personal vision, where you can start to understand and unpack what that might actually mean. It could start to help you identify, not by yourself, but collaboratively, different boundaries that you are able to influence and connect with. It might be able to look at different demands across contexts, that it's not an anything goes in terms of the group decides what they look at. I think this is very mindful that we've got a broader context that our learning has to connect with. And because it's in-house, because it's driven and led by teachers, unlike many other CPD approaches that are externally driven, an internally driven lesson study program has the potential to align and be sympathetic to the cadence and the demands of school life and teachers' professional lives. So again, that's some of the reasons why we think lesson study is helpful here as part of our complex adaptive practice journey. Here are the key features of lesson study. Now, there are different interpretations of lesson study. We have presented here, and in the paper, we use the work of Pete Dudley. There are other versions are available, but we've linked to Pete Dudley because he very much has been the scholar that's put lesson study on the map in our context in the UK. And again, there are different interpretations over in Japan. And I guess Pete Dudley's contextualized it for a UK audience. And we've got, again, this has been adapted, but there are sort of 5 key stages, and I'll explain them very briefly in Dudley's cycle. The first part is the planning stage, where teachers will get together in 2, 3s and 4s and 5s, and will collectively plan a lesson towards an agreed focus. And that planning may also include looking at policy documentation. It may also include looking at research papers as well. So this is not something that's stuck within the knowledge of the group. There's an idea that you'll go out and try and bring new knowledge to that planning process and focus on an issue that you're concerned about, that's real, and you can take that ahead in your own classroom with your own children in your own school. Then there's a teaching phase where the lesson that's been planned will be taught by one of the teachers in that group. And just to focus in there that one of the teachers teach the lesson, you might expect that everyone would have a go at teaching the lesson. But the idea is it's not about the teaching, it's about the planned lesson and the learners. And the observations that happen are very much focused on the learners. So rather than traditional forms of observation, where we would observe the teacher to understand the teaching, the idea here is that we observe learners to understand the learning and how they respond to the planning and the ideas that you had during the planning phase. This approach, lesson study, focuses in on this data-driven. So you would observe a lesson and gather observation notes on 3 or 4 case pupils, people you wanted to look at, see how they were responding to the planned lesson. And then afterwards, you would follow up and interview 2 or 3 of these learners that were observed to understand and get their perspective on the lesson. Then the teachers who planned the lesson would have, online or in person, would have a discussion and a reflection on the lesson and look at that data and the different ideas that emerge from the data. And then there would be a replanning, a recording of the lesson, and so you're ready to try and go again in a revised version of the lesson plan. And a part of that is that you'll also share your findings, maybe not after the first cycle, but after a series of cycles. There's an idea that you'll give back to your teaching community, and you may well report findings formally. It might happen at teacher and service days, departmental meetings, or that might be a bit more informal and have posters or something on a school blog, or even just sharing back with individual teachers. There's an idea that if one group are doing a lesson study in a school, the ideas and information don't just stick with that group. There's an idea that everyone should benefit from it. A bit more of a sort of research community approach. Thanks, Mike. Now, what we were keen, given that this paper was going to be in a special issue about non-linear perspectives to teaching and learning, we're aware that that previous cycle almost looked straightforward and quite linear and cyclical. But in reality, lesson study is not like that. There's a potential for things to be very messy within and between the different stages. And again, these ideas, 3 points here, we're not limited to why lesson study is actually, the cycle is not straightforward. It's an idea that classrooms and learners are complex and unpredictable, as Mike's argued in the first half. So again, what happens in that planned lesson doesn't necessarily unfold exactly as it was planned. The participants' understanding of teaching, and Mike talked about personal histories, these things are different. And when you come together to reflect post-lesson with your data and your own experiences of that, your different personal histories, and I guess your personal visions might lead to quite a lot of differences of opinion as part of that. And also, there's evidence here from Bocala's work that different teachers at different levels, Mike talked at different stages of their career, would experience lesson study differently. And also, people that have experienced lesson study in the past and compared to novices, they would also experience the process completely differently. So seeing that cycle of Dudley's has been quite straightforward is not really the case. And that's what we argue in the paper, that it's actually a lot messier, as you would imagine. Just keen to put that point across. So there are potential, according to Ovens, disappointed he's not here. the potential for what Evans and co might call different lines and intensities of movement. I guess drawing on some of Deleuze's work there. And participants will individually and collectively grapple to make sense of that process as they shift between different stages of the cycle. It's not everyone progressing at the same time in a neat and systematic way. So there's potential for teachers to self-organize as part of that within their own ideas and with others, to recursively revisit ideas as cycles progress from one to the next. And rather than seeing one lesson study cycle with all the complexity I've just outlined there, to assume that one cycle is going to unravel the complexities of teaching, I think the idea of Hervas and Medina here is very helpful to remind us that it might take a number of cycles. This is a lesson study paper. Take a number of cycles, and maybe over time you can look at different pressure points of teaching, and over time you might be able to make modest changes to practice and maybe even complex adaptive practice. So I'll start, and Mike can join in with the bits that I forget. We've got three major projects that we're working with that we see in the future being able to be informed and take ahead these ideas of complex adaptive practice. Two are mentioned in the paper. This one features in the paper, but the one that's not mentioned here is work we do with our undergraduate students across a 4-year program, and how we develop the ideas of complex adaptive practice over a 4-year, 10 interlinked cycles of lesson study. We don't talk about that here. We've picked this one because we think it involves teachers and it's very applied in nature. So we're involved in a lesson study project with an entire secondary school or high school in the west of Scotland. And that was initiated in 2016 by the head teacher, who completed some further study and came across professional learning as what he saw as the key to keeping teachers motivated and keeping them learning together as a group, and focused on a lesson study as part of that. And our involvement came around in 2018 at a conference where one of the people that leads the project, not the head teacher, was at the conference, and I was presenting a lesson study, and so was this person from the school, and we made a connection from there. And that's how Mike and I have been involved as, I guess, critical friends of that project and as a research outfit. The school are very keen for their story about lesson study to be shared and to be told, and Mike's job and my job is to be their critical friends and to work with them to start to tell the story in Scotland and also internationally. In international journals. The project was a very gradual process. The head teacher is very realistic about teacher learning, and this is built up over the course from 2016 till now. It's ongoing, and it started off with a small number of teachers in the school doing a pilot study with lesson study, shared the findings with the whole school at a professional development day, and more teachers started to volunteer to take part in, again, more pilot work. That then led to whole department groups. So it's a secondary school, so English, modern languages, physical education, and so on, starting to do their own group departmental version of lesson study. And now it's built up and built up and built up to every single department in the school voluntarily is taking part in lesson study. So that is mushroomed and evolved over time. It's not been a top-down initiative that happened overnight. It's been something that's been ongoing since 2016, and it's been very gradual. And the teachers, the head teacher's been leading that from a distance, and there are about 4 or 5 key teachers that help to move that project forward. And it's very much teacher-driven, and sign up is completely voluntary. We are now in a stage of working with the school to move on to the next phase of this. One phase was planned. So the next phase of this involves interdepartmental study. So a teacher from PE, modern languages, history, and so on are going to get together to a sort of composite group from different subject areas. And they are now going to plan lesson study around almost generic topics around about education. It might be, for example, about feedback, it might be about instruction, it might be about teaching high stakes examinations and so on. They're going to look at what how to do this across departments. And the latest twist in the story has been brought to the fore from COVID. So these teachers are now doing that project, but it's now a completely online version, which brings its own challenges. So we've got two parts to this now. We've got teachers from different subject areas start to do lesson study, and teachers doing lesson study as a complete online experience, and how you would communicate and look at some of these big features through an online platform. So not easy, but that's where we are. That was the communication with the group last week. So applying the lesson study cycle, the idea is that some of the key features that Mike shared in the first half of the presentation can start to help teachers as they move into this next phase, this online interdepartmental form of lesson study. And we think self-organization, recursive elaboration will absolutely be key features of that, especially in the initial planning meetings. The teachers that lead this project and ourselves have seen this idea that sharing subject knowledges with teachers from different subject areas for the first time could well be quite a daunting experience. So the self-organization that goes around with that, and sharing and being honest and open about visions and your different professional and personal journeys or histories, as Mike said, it might be quite a priority in the early stages of this interdepartmental lesson study. Recursive elaboration, again, so coming back, not just doing one cycle, but a series of cycles where you can get really into the depths of teaching in these different groups, would be supported by that lesson study reflective and inquiry process. That might provide ideas to share and explore visions of individual members, and also what coalesces around group members and their visions as part of that. And also to make sure that when we're pursuing personal visions and a group vision across different departments, the idea is that it's not anything goes. We cannot remove this project and operate in a vacuum that Mike mentioned earlier. There will be bigger ambitions of the school, of the head teacher, and also maybe some wider priorities for education and local authority or at national level. So how do we make connections in these interdepartmental lesson study projects? How do we make bigger and wider connections to some of the priorities of education that are not just stuck within this group? So again, seeing making connections is a key feature of what you need to acknowledge as part of this process. Mike, do you want to add anything else in on that?
Yeah, I just think it's important to highlight that we've been very fortunate that we've been engaging with projects that are long-term, and to some extent, although we've not started off saying this is complex, it actually just highlights the complexity of the whole process, and the fact that these are long-term and that the people we're working with have enabled the teachers to actually be self-organizers and to self-organizing within the different boundaries and engage in this recursive process. And it's going to be a really interesting experience to try and track this as we do with our students at the university. So there's a lot of bits of a jigsaw here falling into place that perhaps 3 or 4 years ago we wouldn't have known. And it's certainly something that I hope we'll be able to report back over an extended period of time. So I'll just let you finish off, Paul.
Yeah, so just to finish, I guess the features that Mike overviewed of complex adaptive practice, when we go into this interdepartmental form of lesson study at Alba Academy, the idea is it might provide some kind of common language or shared agenda between teachers from different subject areas as they move forward with the lesson study process. These ideas, lesson study and complex adaptive practice coming together, sound interesting. And we're excited about them. But again, against the political backdrop in many countries, we've got some hope. But again, there's much research, teacher activism required if these are to come to fruition and become a reality across more than just one school that we've talked about here.
And it's just this whole notion that I don't think anyone listening is going to disagree that teaching is a complex phenomenon. But in the context that we are politically, we're we're moving to some extent away from that complexity. And I do think the 21st century will start to really show how complex the teaching and learning process is, and how teachers of the 21st century really, in every area, need to be these complex, adaptive professionals of the future. Thank you.
Oh, Mike, powerful at the end there, Mike.
Okay, thank you, Mike and Paul. I guess I'll go ahead and start us off discuss, because I have a few questions right off the bat. But as soon this format, we kind of just jump in and ask questions as we can. One question I have, and this goes to Mike, what you had talked about at the end, about political environments. So we do see the educational establishment is essentially set up in a linear fashion, especially within the states with standardized testing. We see that the linearity of education is exemplified within all of our methods courses. We are taught from day one that teaching affects learning, and learning can be assessed in a very rigid and unidimensional fashion. So I understand exactly what you're saying about the ability to inspire transformative information that you develop within your classes through nonlinear pedagogy. How do you explain the notion to an administrator to get them to kind of grapple with this notion that?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose my immediate response is that that's not what we were talking about, but you're absolutely right in the sense that we were talking about what's happening in a classroom. But in a sense, if we take that further, the whole notion of the complex adaptive system that is education, whoever we are going to have to hit every single layer of that system. So I suppose the argument is, unless we actually start to be able to articulate and enact complex adaptive practice in classroom settings, it becomes quite difficult to then convince those people up the hierarchies that we work in. So I think that becomes I don't mean it becomes a different, it's part of the agenda. And actually what Paul was saying is that we'd be very lucky that the head teachers that we've been working with, when we talk about complexity, they go, yeah, we get that. So I think there's part of a journey here that complexity is about wholes, not parts. And the education system as a whole then becomes, how do we develop the skills, the confidence to articulate just what we've tried to articulate with you here about what happens in classrooms? How does that happen across the system? And I'm not for a second suggesting that's dead easy, but I, as a teacher educator, having worked at national level in a number of countries, could maybe do that now. But I have to confess that throughout most of my career at that political arena, that has been a different group of people. So I think, and I go back to my point is that your question is completely legitimate, but unless we can articulate what it looks like and actually see it happening in classroom settings and be able to use that, how do you then articulate that and argue with the other people?
Yeah, absolutely. Just one more point, and this goes along with that, the ability to get kind of administrators and stakeholders to go along. Within a non-linear learning environment, where you have a lot of different emergent learning or knowledge, how do you define success? How do you define student success?
Yeah, and I think that in a sense, I'm not sure even this is a complex one. I think that goes back to this complex interaction between your vision and the vision of the system. Because the vision of the system, as you were suggesting, as we've suggested, is often different to what our vision would be. And in the neoliberal context, if teachers, as Paul said at the beginning, if teachers are perceived as technicians, the answer to your question is that success will be how it is being defined by the system, i.e. by those up the hierarchy. And if, taking this on, if we are going to be working in a democracy where the voice of the teachers as professionals is legitimate, that's when you would start to say, well, actually, I as a teacher, over time, I am being successful. And I would probably argue that the game is to hit what the system wants you to do and then go and get on with what you really want to do. So.
Maybe add one or two things in. I know that there'll be other questions too. Just Jesse, when you're talking about convincing administrators, it took me right back to the first day we met with not the school Alba Academy, but a second school we work with that had never done lesson study before, and through various connections came to Mike and I and asked us about lesson study. We had a meeting with the head teacher and several deputies, and it was all positive for the head teacher. And one of the deputies who's in charge of teaching and learning in the school, to improve that, said, "This is great, does it work?" And I said, well, it can work, but you've got to invest in it. It's not going to be an overnight, flash in the pan and everything's going to be great. It's going to take a lot of investment of time, of some cash, of teachers believing in this way of working. So that just took me right back to convincing leaders that even in our Scottish context, which seems to be a bit more loose with how they're thinking about teaching and learning, there's still people that are in charge of enhancing that. And then back to Mike and the points he was making about administrators. And I think we've got to convince teachers about and remind them that teaching is also is complex. And I'm not saying that they don't know that, but teachers make a lot of shortcuts up to handle the complexity, and a lot of the ways that they're in the midst of it. And sometimes that complexity in their minds gets simplified as well. So reminding them about that and getting them to have their own vision as part of what that means for achievement and success and whatnot, I think it's really important. And we might then start to see teachers pushing back a little bit against what administrators are looking at and are asking for. So I think that's important too.
I do like what you guys talked about with, you actually brought up communities of practice, kind of, you had brought it in a roundabout way. You talked about learning community. I think you actually said learning communities between the teachers as they start going through this process. And obviously communities of practice are actually an emergent product as well. So it kind of blended in a lot with your presentation. So does anybody else want to chime in? Any questions? There you go, Luis.
Well, good morning to everyone from Brazil.
Hi.
And I would like to congratulate Paul and Mike. It's a very solid, very consistent work you have presented. And I have three questions. The first one is when we talk about lesson study in Brazil, we learned about it from John Eliot. He works, I believe he still works in East Anglia, in the London area from England, but you did not quote or mention John Eliot's contribution or either Lawrence's Stenhouse. I would like to know if they contributed to your vision about the lesson study, or if it's a different framework that you use. And that part when you mentioned the teachers' personal visions and their pivotal role to the self-organizing, process, I would like to know if there's any reference based on research about that, because John Elliott's framework is related to that. So that would be my first two questions. And the last one, it's a methodological question, perhaps. The recursive elaboration, it's similar to anticipatory reflection. I don't know if you are familiar with anticipatory reflection, but Don Garbett and Lynn Thomas, they just published a recent paper on self-study they did, and they used anticipatory reflection. But when you talked about recursive elaboration, I believe there is some similar points, perhaps. But I don't know if if you are aware of that, of anticipatory reflection. And Mike's comment on the, that we need to, if we want as teachers to or to help teachers to win this game against the system, the neoliberal system, we need to achieve the system's goals, but also keep pursuing our own goals. And this paper by Lynn and Dawn, they explore that issue. So that got me thinking about it. So that's it.
All right, Paul, go.
Give you some more thinking time, Mike. Yeah, thank you, Louise. So many insightful points and questions in all of that. I'll start off with the John Elliott Dudley paper. Yeah, we are aware of Elliott's work, John Elliott's work, and the work that he's done and has done in the research centre down at East Anglia. And there's also some nice work come out of that from Penny Lamb in the physical education world as well. And I guess what we've done here is that Dudley and Elliott have both built a culture, especially down in the southeast of England, for lesson study. And I think in more recent times, Dudley's work's been picked up at national level a little bit more, and been seen to be funded quite heavily by different initiatives down in Camden, down in London. So again, it's got in the last few years a little bit more exposure, if you like. So we've clicked in with Dudley's work. We haven't ruled out anything that John Elliott's done and the prestigious work he's done there. But again, Dudley just seems to be at the moment, for a Scottish context, a neat frame that we can use to give teachers a bit of structure to what it is that they're looking to try and achieve in school. Well, that's why we've got that extra work in that we had a slide about. Dudley's work's fine, but I think it oversimplifies at first glance the process. So that's why we've been really keen to acknowledge Dudley, but also try and just push back against ideas and criticisms that it could be overly simplistic. So yeah, so that's why we're close to Dudley, but we've not disregarded some of Elliott's work either. And we'll return to that as part of this project as well, I assume.
I think certainly I've been at there's this huge conference, the World Association of Lesson Study, where thousands of people go. And it's really interesting how lesson study has evolved very, very quickly as it's moved beyond Japan. And I've been out to Japan 3 times and been involved in work that they do there. And again, culturally, lesson study is very much locked into the culture of Japan and Japanese education. And going back to some extent, Jesse's point, its first reincarnation was in North America. And therefore it followed, it was adapted to fit in with North American culture. And as it's gone around the world, as with religions, as with philosophies, as with everything, it is adapted to context. So at the moment, every time, certainly I've spoken at international conferences, people almost say, you're not doing a lesson study properly. But I think the answer is that lesson study, going back to the really early point, is that it enables us to look at the complexity of teaching in context. And to some extent, the policies and the histories in different countries will influence the way that the education system sort of moves. In terms of your teacher vision, the work of Hammerness has informed the work that we've done. So we could send you the paper that we've got published, or Paul could. And that certainly, a lot of the early work on teacher vision was about what teachers saw in the classroom. So it was very behaviorist in terms of how it looked at vision. Hammerness was really, and along with Schulman, towards at the turn of the century in North America, started to open up the idea of teacher vision as being something that was a bit more than just specifically what happened within there. And I would take a pot here and say that teacher vision for education is something that the education profession needs to start to invest in if we're not going to end up all being technicians. We need teachers to be able to articulate what their vision is for education, and in the context of us, most of us here, what that looks like for physical education. And I forgot the other questions, so you better answer them, Paul.
It was probably more for you, but I'll just add in there before you take the next question about methods and recursive elaboration in Don Garbutt's paper. You can maybe have a think about that. Yeah, just back to Louise and his idea of how vision intertwines with self-organization. I think in the paper that we've talked about today, there's self-organization as one of the features of complex adaptive practice. We're very much embedded the idea of vision, teacher vision, as part of that, as part of the personal history, part of the ways that people would arrive, not all being self-organizing in the same way. So what is it that teachers might bring to the fore that makes them see and debate and discuss and maybe even make decisions differently? And that was one of the key, amongst many others, that was one of the key areas that we tuned into, to show that self-organization happens, but not necessarily the same way for everyone. And vision and how that has been influenced over time through experience, through your different professional learning, through you as a person, how that might enable you to self-organize differently from Jesse, from Mike to Dylan and so on. And that's what the paper talks about when we introduce self-organization and how vision's embedded in it.
And the final point about recursive elaboration.
I'm not sure if we've got an awful lot of literature in there, Mike, but we've got away with it. So
right, recursive elaboration will include work from so many other areas. I think the key point is that we need to move away from the quick fix. We need to move away from everything being the immediate. Learning, development is a long-term process, and revisiting things and reflecting upon things. And I haven't read Don's paper, but I am sure it's exactly in line with what we're talking about. And one of the things that drives me absolutely bonkers is I do work, or have done a lot of work with our first-year students, and I do lots of work with our fourth-year students. And the number of fourth-year students that say, we did this in first year. Now, we learn by revisiting things. And as we work our way through things and revisit things, that's how we consolidate our learning. That's how we elaborate our learning. And the idea that we do something once and therefore we've learned it is, in Scottish language, bollocks, absolute nonsense. You know, we need to revisit, and the whole process of reflection becomes so important as part of that process.
Yeah, I'll just add there too, Mike, just come back to a recursive elaboration, moving away from the quick fix. Wrapped up in all of that, sometimes the quick fix doesn't necessarily concern teachers. So we end up in this neoliberal climate of improvement and attainment and success and effectiveness. We end up trying to solve some of the problems that a school has or a local authority have. And I think Ken Jones, one of his publications about teacher education and professional learning across Europe, ends up talking about competing priorities. We end up having a wrestle between teachers' intellectual curiosities and what the head teacher wants and what the school demands are and what local authorities want and what a nation wants. So we end up sometimes, in an effort to try and improve school effectiveness, we end up going for these quick fixes which are about not necessarily personal to the demands of the teachers. So recursive elaboration of professional learning, keeping that longer term and maybe trying to figure out how we negotiate as part of the boundaries teachers' individual professional desires along with school professional cultures outside that as well. So,
hey, so we are a little bit, we're past an hour. So does anybody have any other questions to kind of wrap everything up or kind of chime in?
Sorry, can I ask a question, perhaps a question? I just realised here, sorry, hello everybody, and I just realised I've got my husband's name there, Elizabeth here.
I know, Eric, I think. Do
Yes, perhaps you do. I think he knows you. Oh, he actually has met you. Probably a question, I'm not sure if I'm kind of understanding well. So you've mentioned something about self-organization is constrained and enabled by boundaries. I was just wondering, this notion of boundaries, how similar or similar is the notion of affordances? And perhaps you can just maybe elaborate very quickly or clarify very quickly, because I'm quite aware of the time as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you, again, going back to the work of Gibson, which very much informed the motor control people and the language of that, then certainly in the world that I inhabited was about the constraints in terms of movement development and movement learning. And then affordances in terms of what the environment afforded people, whatever. So I think, again, one of the issues we have in the complexity world that we live in is that, the more I read, the shift to complexity is not a theory, it is a paradigm shift. And the difficulty is that within different disciplines and sub-disciplines, that language is emerging all the time that in essence says the same thing, or more or less the same thing. And we end up going, actually, no, I'm a dynamical systems person and I don't think complexity, or I'm an ecological person, or whatever. So I think we have one of the great problems in the postmodern or postmodern world that we live in, is that we have broken away from this positivist one-size-fits-all, and we've ended up with people creating their own clubs. So Justin O'Connor and I wrote a paper about this in PE, that more is happening in physical education than it's ever happened. But what we've now got is we've got different camps who create a different language. So my response would be is, I think, I'm not sure, but I think I could write the same paper talking about constraints and affordances, because I think they're more or less the same thing. But I think they've been contextualized differently in the world that we live in, which isn't really, it's not about getting out of the argument. It's actually about saying part of the problem we've got now is language. And I think they mean the same, more or less the same things. And I found that moving to the idea, and I discovered boundaries, and all of a sudden, opened a page, and all of a sudden there was all these papers about boundaries that I didn't know existed. But the paper I wrote with Justin was called Border Crossing, not Boundary Crossing. But border means the same as boundary means the same as constraint? Discuss. Does that answer in a way?
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Anybody else have a question? Anybody that hasn't got one in yet?
Can I just ask one really quick question? I know we're well over time. I'm just wondering, does complex adaptive practice and negotiation boundaries, as you spoke about, does that place an awful lot of pressure on the agency, or a lot of emphasis on the agency of the teacher? And then that could lead to somewhat of unwanted pressure from a teacher's perspective.
Well, my answer to that is that teachers self-organize and negotiate boundaries anyway. So if a teacher stands up and just delivers, they've made a self-organizing decision just to deliver, and the boundaries are very, very tight. So in a sense, from a descriptive perspective, the boundaries are already there, but what they're doing to some extent is ignoring them, and they are self-organizing and delivering. So I think your point is right, is that if you take this really, really seriously, your head would explode. Because if you're going every boundary and I've got to self-organize, so in essence, it's ultimately about us making sense. And I think my argument would be is that if we shift from the complicated world of teaching towards something that's more complex, if you go too far, you die, you would explode, you just couldn't do it. So therefore, how do you start to make that transition, and what boundaries are you legitimately able to engage with? Which goes back to my recursive elaboration process. And guess what? You will engage with boundaries and you'll get it wrong, because that's part of the human condition. We're not going to get it all right. So how do you, and I can only talk personally, I do this now in my teaching in a way that I never did 10, 15 years ago. But I've been teaching for 40 years now. And you might come along and say, Mike, that teaching was absolutely awful. But I feel quite comfortable that my job is to set some sort of boundaries by setting the task, and then actually responding to how the students react to those tasks. So and that's a big change in my thinking over time, and trying to support their self-organizing. So I think it's a gradual process. And I imagine for most people, there's a tipping point where all of a sudden they go, I get this. I feel comfortable with this. But I think we are, I don't know, Jesse, you seem to be nodding your head to agree.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right on track with that. Yeah, that's exactly the way kind of that the whole notion that the way you put it about how teachers will, the environment is already self-organizing. So no matter what, the agency, it can get overwhelmed. However, when you encapsulate it the way you have just said, it becomes a little bit more manageable. And I think that's kind of one of the key points there.
Yeah, I'll just, Dylan, great. Yeah, I'll just add one tiny bit, because it was a really, really good question. And we got asked to add more detail on that exact point in the paper when we got first round of feedback. People, when we gave the example, not of the Alba Academy one that we used in the presentation, the one that we do with our undergraduate students, the reviewer said, there's an awful lot of interesting stuff about boundaries earlier. Show me it here, what you do with that at undergraduate level. And we've tried to isolate some of the boundaries in our undergraduate teaching. And Mike's already said these are limitless, and also we've got that individual environment, task, ecological frame. And not that you can isolate them completely, but we've started to try and do that in our undergraduate teaching, where in the early stages, it's very much about how do you, as a complex adaptive practitioner, how do you start to negotiate and use flexible learning intentions? And that was very much about the tasks that you might set up, the example that we used. And then in our sort of third year of our program, the example we have there is, again, not to completely just pick one or two of these, but the idea is that how do you start to identify and negotiate some of the wider boundaries, some of the environmental boundaries, and we start to look at national education policy and how you can start to understand and interpret that, not to implement it, but to enact it in a way that's suitable for context in that sense. And the last thing with our fourth year students before they leave, we very much focus a fourth year course on vision, teachers' professional vision, and the professional development, cognitive, social, emotional requirements they'll have professional development wise to achieve that vision in 5 years, also work towards it. And that was very much starting to look at those individual boundaries. So we were asked to add a bit more of that on the paper, and it became my job to do that. So a great question. It was what we were asked to do a bit more of, and we managed to explain that a bit more. So thanks.
Great, thanks, Paul. Thanks, Mike. Really
No
interesting.
worries.
Excellent. Does anybody have any other questions? Anything else to wrap it up?
Not exactly a question, but a comment related to Emmerich's question and the answer. We are working from a few years ago until now with the notion of environmental demands, and I believe it is connected to the question about how similar would be the boundaries and the affordances. And then we, as Paul has mentioned, we try to divide, not exactly simplify, but divide the complexity in a few pairs of environmental demands, such as political and sociological and historical, geographical, virtual, administrative, economic, and a few more issues, and physical and natural. And the complexity framework is that we try to connect them all together, studying each lesson. So it's quite connected to the lesson study approach. But the thing is, I think that we try to relate the boundaries to the environmental demands, but we try to explore those boundaries in order to teach the students about them. So I think when we try to teach about the boundaries, then we have the affordances, because we are expanding, we are moving beyond the boundaries. So I agree with Emmerich and your answer to her, Mike, because I believe it's connected, but I think we need to elaborate more about this issue.
Yeah, I mean, I would, just to throw one sort of almost last point in, is that teachers, all we can really do is negotiate boundaries. There's not a lot else that teachers can do, or affordances or constraints. So to understand boundaries is almost at the heart of the whole process, depending on how you define them. And if that means that you've got to change the task because the boundaries of this task are not right and they don't work, it's the same thing. And go back to Dylan, your question. So they're all out there, but actually all we can really do as the teacher is, and in the other language, the ecological language, manipulate the boundaries. That's just about all that teachers can do. And so I think the more we understand those ideas, I think they are really, really important for the future. And that would be my final thought.
Awesome. So anything else? Any last comments before we kind of adjourn? Okay. Awesome presentation, Mike and Paul. It was a great to hear from you guys. So we'll plan on having another meeting in March, and I hope to see as many of you as possible can be there. I know sometimes our time zones don't match up, so it'll probably be a little bit earlier or later. depending on, because we'll probably try to get it to accommodate Alan and Tim's schedule next time. But it was great having you
Can I
guys.
just say, Dylan's put in a question, and I'm just going to respond to that because Paul and I have been reading, no, that's not true. Paul actually spent a month reading about 4 pages of Deleuze and Guattari. Did you manage to get 4 pages done? But yeah, there's another example in that question, that comment you've just made, how this, shared concepts, but another set of different language.
Yeah.
And we're trying to work out how we can get Deleuze and Guattari stuff into the next paper we write. So there's this big problem at the moment that unless you're into this, you could end up saying, I don't understand that because it's not using my language. It's becoming more and more. Sorry for interrupting, Jesse, but I just thought I'd respond.
That's great. So I will see you guys in 2 months then. If you do
Thank you very much, everybody.
What was that?
Thank you very much.
Oh, no problem.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. That's great.
Sometimes you do these things and there's no questions. So we've actually, I think for once, the questions have lasted longer than the presentation.
Yes,
that doesn't happen.
That's great.
It's because the audience are so well informed. That's what it is.
Yes.
Well, everybody take care and stay well.
Brilliant. Thank you, everyone. Nice to see you all. Thanks, Jesse, for organizing as well.
Thanks, Jesse.
Thanks, Jesse. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Mike. Thanks, everyone.
Pleasure.